Você já pensou onde está o motor de crescimento mundial? Enquanto o PIB global cresce perto de 3% ao ano, setores como inteligência artificial, semicondutores, infraestrutura digital e energia limpa avançam a 10%, 12%, 15% respectivamente. E esse crescimento não está no Brasil. Em sua grande maioria, as oportunidades de investimento nesses setores estão nos Estados Unidos, na Europa e na Ásia. Eu sou Márcio Brito, Head Investor do Banco Itaú Internacional. E neste quinto episódio do Visão Global, vamos analisar e comparar os desempenhos das bolsas de valores no Brasil e nos Estados Unidos. Você sabia que nos últimos 10 anos, o investidor que manteve exposição ao S&P 500 não apenas superou o Ibovespa, como triplicou seu capital? Entre 2017 e 2024, o Ibovespa cresceu em média 9% ao ano, saindo de cerca de 63 mil pontos para 120 mil. Enquanto isso, o S&P 500, principal índice da Bolsa Americana, entregou 14% ao ano na última década, chegando a mais de 6.500 pontos em 2025. Ajustado pelo câmbio, o ganho em reais ficou entre 15% e 18% ao ano. O mercado de capitais americano é o maior do mundo. O S&P 500 sozinho representa 80% da capitalização de bolsa dos Estados Unidos, com um valor total de 50 trilhões de dólares. Na B3, a bolsa brasileira, estamos falando de 1 trilhão de dólares em valor de mercado, abaixo de empresas como Apple, Nvidia, Alphabet, Microsoft e Amazon. Esse volume garante liquidez robusta e maior estabilidade para o investidor de longo prazo. Vamos aproveitar esse momento para falar com Niraj Patel, Chief Equity Strategy no Banco Itaú Internacional. Raj, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
It's great to be here with everyone to give my perspective on the equity markets outside of Brazil, where I've actually spent most of my time professionally investing. So I probably have a different home bias relative to what was discussed before, being a US investor most of my life.
Perfect. So let's just get right into it. So beyond the historical performance, currency impact, and market size, do you think there is any other advantage in investing in the US stock market?
Well, I think the best way to start with that answer is Roberto Martins, in a previous episode, said there were 3 reasons, and they were all diversification. So diversification is the biggest reason. And what does that mean? It means the equity markets outside of Brazil move differently than in Brazil. And the fancy term for that is correlation. Okay. So when Brazil is trading down, US is moving up. When US is down, Brazil is up. So that lowers the volatility of the overall portfolio so that the investor has less volatility and still good returns. So the idea is here, diversification can be your friend. And maybe just to put some numbers around it, if you look at over the last 10 years, the S&P 500 has given investors 14% return, which is great. It's beaten the historical average for the S&P. It's beaten many markets. But even during that period, the volatility of the US was less than Brazil, meaning that each day the market in the US was having less moves up and down. And so that makes it just easier as an investor. There's less stress. You don't have to watch it day to day. And if you combine that with the Brazilian market and take an average, then you're even reducing the volatility even more. And then the other diversification benefit is that the S&P 500 is diversified itself. So you have 40% of revenues coming from outside of the US. And I'm sure most investors know Apple products are sold everywhere, right? It's all over the world. But another example is Berkshire Hathaway. They own companies that are listed on the Japanese stock exchange. So this is just another example of how diversification benefits you as an investor. And look, there is concentration in terms of the technology sector right now. Nvidia is the largest company in the world, but many people probably never heard of it 10 to 15 years ago. And the largest company in 10 to 15 years from now might not have even been started. And maybe just to tie it together with an example that Marcelo Olsen gave in a previous episode, he talked about World Cup winners. And it's better to bet on a variety of countries not just Brazil. I mean, we all want Brazil to win every World Cup, but it's not going to happen, right? And so if you have a lot of different winners and you pick more than one country, that increases your chances. Well, one of the nice factors around investing outside of the U.S. or outside of Brazil, is the fact that there's going to be a future champion that might not have even been created. Yeah, and so that will be a global champion on the investing side that will happen in 10, 15, 20 years from now. And you get access to that through a global diversified index.
No, okay, very clear. So can you give us more details? Let's explore this a little bit more. So what explains this difference between the Brazil and the markets outside in international markets?
I mean, again, maybe just taking a step back and looking at some numbers. Might be repetitive, but if you look at the IMF numbers, Brazilian GDP is around 2.4% of global GDP, right? So by just investing in Brazil, you're excluding 97 to 98% of the world, right? So that's a huge market that you're missing out on. And again, using previous examples, Daniel Haddadi gave the example of the grocery shopping and the shelves. So let's say you had, to only pick from 2 to 3 shelves out of 100. That's not great, right? When you go to your local grocery store. But to take that analogy even a step further, imagine going to the grocery store and not having the ability to buy from the best shelves with the best products. You're excluding a big part of your shopping experience. I mean, that would not be fun at all to go shopping in that type of a grocery store. And so I think that's one interesting fact. The other is, outside of Brazil, there's been, if you look at the US, a rich history on the technology sector, healthcare sector, that's developed over many years, right? You have Silicon Valley that's been developed through combination of capital, innovation, and some luck. It's been replicated elsewhere. If you look at Taiwan with the semiconductor industry, Japan with the auto industry before that. But this is kind of a unique situation that's developed over time in the US. And maybe just to segue into another topic related, markets outside of Brazil become very sophisticated and customized, where there's so many different ETFs. Just to give a few examples, over the last 10 years, if you invested in the technology sector ETF, you would have had a 21% annual return. On the other side, if you had invested in the healthcare sector ETF, you would have around an 8% annual return. So very different returns. Obviously, by specializing or investing in specific ETFs, you increase your risk, you increase your potential for return, using the technology sector example. But that's just an example of how sophisticated the markets have become. And an interesting fact, just recently, the number of ETFs listed in the US, according to Morningstar, now outnumbers the number of stocks. Wow. It's around 4,500 ETFs. So the ability to customize and invest in what you want in global markets has become pretty amazing with the number of ETFs that are out there now.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, with so many ETFs out there, I mean, it's definitely a investment theme for each one of the investors out there, right? But talking a little bit about the opportunities, right? You mentioned at the beginning that the S&P 500 for the past 10 years performed like 13-14% per year, right? So the U.S. stock market have this history of very consistent results. What explains this?
Well, look, if you look at some of the world's biggest growth trends, the U.S. market has been able to capitalize on that. So the advent of the internet, right? You had many big companies in the U.S. take advantage of that situation. We're on the verge of the start of the AI, artificial intelligence revolution. So that's another area where the U.S. companies so far have been able to capture a lot of the value there. You have other emerging trends, energy related, healthcare related. So these are just a bunch of examples of how the U.S. has been able to capitalize on these major growth trends. The other thing is the U.S. companies have done a good job with capital allocation. So capital allocation is, they're good at spending their money. We all make bad decisions, but overall, companies in the U.S. have done a good job when markets are stressed to buy back their own stock, but also to make acquisitions to grow. I mean, examples include Meta when they bought Instagram, right? So they have the ability to find the right businesses that they think will have big growth potential, which then increases the returns.
No, perfect. So this explains the past. Right? So now looking ahead, what do you think, what are the factors that can favor or hinder the performance of the US markets and the Brazilian market?
Look, we talked about the concentration with technology, NVIDIA, the growth trend with artificial intelligence. I think the biggest risk for US markets and opportunity is artificial intelligence, right? If all of a sudden the spending that's been going on proves to be wasted, it doesn't give the appropriate returns, then that will be a big setback for US markets. Right, so I think that's the one thing to focus on and follow and watch, which we are doing at Itaú. The second, if you look at Brazil, there have been periods when Brazilian equities have done really well. Yep. If you go back to the mid to late 2000s, when Chinese economy was urbanizing, you had very strong GDP growth in China. Brazil itself was also growing at a pretty rapid pace, and that caused markets in Brazil to perform really well. So if we have a repeat of that type of a window, that could help the Brazilian market. Also, if you look at other maybe similar countries to Brazil, India in the last decade has become a really good market in terms of equity price performance. And so if Brazil is able to maybe take some of those changes that maybe are going on in India, that could be a recipe for success for Brazil as well.
Yeah. No, it makes a lot of sense. So to conclude, what would be your advice to a Brazilian investor looking to build a long-term position in foreign equities?
So look, the first step is to have a plan. Right? I think investors, if they come to the US or global markets without a plan, that's where you can get into trouble. How much risk do you want to take? Where are you looking to diversify? I think having a well thought out plan will make sure that you can handle the market volatility. There's going to be setbacks. Markets will have drawdowns. But if you're there with a plan, then you can stick to that plan and know how to deal with the volatility. So I think that's the first step. I think the second step, like the famous Nike slogan, just do it. Right? I think there's always a hesitation of trying to find the perfect time. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to wait. I know we had a series, one episode talking about FX. Yeah. Look, even if there is things that are holding you back, even starting with a little bit and doing it in increments, once you start and get the ball rolling, I think that gets the momentum, and then you start to learn about the markets, and that's I think the second piece of advice for Brazilians that are looking to invest outside of Brazil.
Perfect. Raj, thank you very much for being here with us.
Great. Thanks for inviting me. It's been great to have this conversation.
Quando analisamos a eficiência dos mercados, o investidor que opta por alocar em bolsa americana tem acesso a um ecossistema de empresas globais, alta liquidez e regulação estável. De acordo com o World Investment Report de 2025, um documento produzido pela ONU, os fluxos globais de investimentos caíram 11% em 2024, mas os aportes em economia digital e nas empresas americanas continuam em expansão. Segundo estimativas de mercado, os setores digitais dos Estados Unidos crescem de 10% a 12% ao ano, mais do que 3 vezes o ritmo do PIB global. É difícil falar de bolsa americana sem destacar o peso e a relevância das empresas de tecnologia. Quando falamos em excepcionalismo americano, não é só uma questão geopolítica ou de estabilidade institucional. É também sobre inovação. As maiores empresas do mundo em valor de mercado são americanas. Apple, Microsoft, NVIDIA, Amazon, e todas elas são protagonistas em setores que estão moldando o futuro, com inteligência artificial, computação em nuvem, semicondutores e automação. E o acesso a investimentos internacionais são a ponte para essas tendências. Seja por meio de renda fixa, renda variável ou alternativos, clientes Itaú Private podem contar com a curadoria de especialistas do mercado americano e global, para identificar as melhores oportunidades de investimento de acordo com seus objetivos. No 6º e último programa da série, vamos falar sobre investimentos alternativos. parte da estratégia de diversificação internacional.
Este vídeo tem finalidade exclusivamente informativa. Não constitui pesquisa de investimento nem aconselhamento financeiro e nenhuma recomendação ou orientação financeira está sendo oferecida. O conteúdo do vídeo não leva em consideração os objetivos de investimento, a situação financeira ou as necessidades específicas de nenhum investidor. As opiniões e pontos de vista expressos neste vídeo podem divergir daqueles de outros departamentos ou divisões do Itaú e de suas afiliadas.